Hey readers, writers, and friends, Story Servant here. Today we're talking about Kendare Blake's new book, Champion of Fate. It was released by Quilltree Books at imprint of HarperCollins in 2023. But before we get into that, today's random words are like, share, subscribe, regurgitate. This review does contain a few spoilers, so be warned. I include these spoilers because it has to do with the conflict, or lack thereof, and some of the consequences, or lack thereof, later on. I found my copy, as you can see from all the little markings, at the library. Because I had read Blake's previous series, Three Dark Crowns, and I enjoyed a lot of the things about it, the writing was very solid, and so I thought, okay, we'll pick up the new one. As a basic premise, your Champion of Fate here is referring to the Aristine. They are an order that serve the goddess of glory, and they are made immortal and expertly strong, and they are all women. So kind of like Amazons on steroids is sort of the premise. And they go out into the world to gain glory for the goddess, not through great acts they themselves do per se, but by finding heroes in the world and bringing them to great glory, facilitating their great deeds. Reed, our point of view character, wants desperately to become a member of the Aristine after her family is slaughtered. We've discovered this slaughtering at the very beginning, so let's get into what's going well. This book has a high production value. There are really beautiful papers separating each section. There are 4 of them. There's a map included, these lovely little illustrations throughout. So this, obviously, money went into the production of this book. It's very nice. Our protagonist's inner conflict, like I said, is established by the trauma she experiences early on in what is part 1, and you can see the size of part 1. We'll talk about that later, but we experience that trauma with her, so we know why she is as conflicted as she is. I think the most interesting conflict that she is struggling with is hating the group of individuals who murdered her family, and later having to contend with meeting an individual from that group and not espousing to him all of the qualities of her previous attackers. I think that's a really great moral and struggle to be including, particularly in modern day literature for young adults and teens. Blake, as always, does a fantastic job with the world building for the most part, and her action scenes are always terrific. They are fast-paced, they're deeply embodied so that you feel the action along with the protagonist, and you feel for her as she's going through all of these struggles. That's one of the things Blake does really well, is she gets that deep embodied sense of who her main character really is, so that we as the reader lose ourselves with them in the story. We are introduced to characters, many of them, along the way, but never in a way that feels like it's info dumpy. There are not too many main characters or too many named characters for the story to handle at any given time. And we do get to meet someone who does not want to become an immortal Amazon on steroids, and that's her friend Gretchen, who, despite having gone through all the training, chooses before finally committing, no, I really want to go back home and I want to make a good marriage and have babies and live a happy life, the sort of thing that many, if not, dare I say, most women would really be motivated by. It's really nice to see that there is a little bit of balance with that character. As for what's not working, let's stick with Gretchen. Including her feels a little more like lip service to the growing awareness around the fact that, yeah, most women aren't super duper satisfied by just a career. Most women don't really want to go into battle. That doesn't sound like a good time to them. and the fact that many men are very uncomfortable with women going into battle, which is something she addresses, but always from the perspective of, but these Aristines are great big warrior women. Can't you see how competent and wonderful they're going to be? You, as a man, are wrong for thinking that maybe women shouldn't be on the front lines. And as a result, Gretchen's character feels a little more like lip service than anything sincere. So while it's great that she's included, I'm not really sure Blake herself believes any of that, or that she's including it for really sincere reasons. Could be wrong, but that's how I read it. There are also some very basic storyteller mistakes being made in this book, which makes me wonder about the timeline on when she started to when she finished it, and how much actual editing at the content level went into this. So as I brought up before, you can see this little chunk of pages, that's part 1. Now when you divide a book into 4 parts, it's okay if they're not exactly the same length, but they should be a little bit closer. Part 1 basically functions like a slightly longer prologue than it does a real part 1 or chapter 1. And because it's missing some things, and there are parts of this introduction that are important later, they get told as cringe of cringe flashbacks in part 2. If it was important enough for us to see it, just put it in part 1. It really would have felt much more seamless to include those portions of the story in part 1 than to pull us out of part 2 to go back. Part 2 also does something that I thought most good authors were well past, and that is some terrible maid and butler dialogue. For those of you who don't know, maid and butler dialogue comes from the plays of the early 1900s, where you would literally have the maid and the butler come out on stage and have some conversation like, and of course you know that the master of the house has been gone for 3 weeks, but he arrives home tonight. Oh yes, of course, and won't the mistress be surprised? You know, these kinds of things where they are talking to each other about things they already know in a conversation they would never have. But because the audience needs to know these things, they must come out and explain to get everybody where they need to be. It's a form of exposition. It's very clunky. It's not realistic. And as a result, when you have characters talking about things they already know in a way that isn't natural, it comes off very stilted, and the reader knows, I'm being told things right now. We don't usually want to be told things. We want to experience them. We want to be shown them. And while dialogue between characters can be an excellent way of bringing details and needed exposition into a story so that you're not having big old, expose paragraph dumps, if they're talking about stuff they already know in a way they wouldn't do naturally, it doesn't work. And I'm telling you, it doesn't work. It came off very forced. Didn't love it. And while Reed's internal conflicts are obvious, she has seen the image of her future hero way before she was supposed to, and so she's developed an attachment to him in a way that isn't going to be healthy for someone who has to show up, facilitate their glory, and then leave. We are told in the blurb, let's see what the book has to say about itself, huh? Aristine are mythical female warriors, we already got that, part of a legendary order, though heroes might be immortalized in stories. It's the Aristine who guide them to victory. They are the hero makers. Ever since she was an orphan taken in by the order, Reed has wanted to be an Aristine. Now, as an initiate, just one challenge stands in her way. She must shepherd her first hero to glory on the battlefield. Succeed, and Reed will take her place beside her sisters. Fail, and she'll be cast from the only home she's ever known. Nothing is going to stop Reed until she meets her hero. Hestian is fiery and infuriating, but what begins as an alliance becomes more. And as secrets of the order come to light, Reed begins to understand what becoming an Aristine may truly cost. Battle looming, she must choose the order and the life she had planned, or Hestian and the one she never expected. Okay, That blurb leads us to believe that this is going to be a romance. That seeing Hestian, her hero, before she was supposed to and developing that connection to him means she's going to fall in love with this guy. She's going to choose him. This book is not a romance. Let me disabuse you of that right now. While there are occasional romantic elements and there is a romantic tension between her and Hestian, there is nothing about a satisfying romance that comes out of this book. This book is also listed as one of one as part of a series, so it's possible that that relationship is something that gets built upon in later books, but because it is so deeply unsatisfying in book one, I think Blake is going to struggle to keep people going with the series. We are also set up some very specific stakes in that blurb. If Reed fails to make Hestian a hero the way she's supposed to, she's going to be booted from the order. Now here's the thing. I love religion as part of fantasy stories. As a religious individual myself, I really appreciate people of genuine faith being portrayed in fictitious literature. However, when you do that, you kind of have to make a choice about how your deities show up in your world. Either your deities have in the past done lots of hands-on, seemingly supernatural, big power kind of things, and it's tapered off into the present, or they have continued to do that throughout, or they were based on a myth and the church as an entity is what keeps that faith going. Either way, you either have consequences, stipulations, the order of things being established by that deity and then continued by the church, by the deity and continued by the deity, or set up by the church and continued by the church. This book fails to have any sort of consistency. The Goddess of Glory has real power in this world. There are supernatural happenings that are continually displayed. Her power is manifest through the Aristine in terms of their battle prowess, women being able to stand up against men on the battlefield, for one, their immortality, the fact that they can call forth their shining armor out of the ether whenever they want. Things like this. So we see that the goddess does have real world power in this world. And we are told from the blurb that if Reed fails to make a hero of Hestian, she will be booted from the order. And that there will be these consequences. She will no longer be allowed to be part of the Aristine. Except that's not what happens. Reed refuses to be the kind of Aristine she is directed to be, and rather than that resulting in her going home with Hestian, which she completely ruins that relationship in a really stupidly obvious way, which I found truly annoying. But then there are no consequences. None. The Aristine come back and get her and say, oh, just kidding, it's been decided you can be an Aristine anyway. The Goddess of Glory neither acknowledges the sacrifice that she has chosen to make, nor deals out any consequences for the fact that she didn't do the way she was instructed. This is nonsense. The conflicts that it creates within itself, there's just this internal dissidence that I just don't like. It's not satisfying. It doesn't make sense to me. If you're the Goddess of Glory and your adherents don't do what you tell them to do, there's going to be consequences. And the only consequence, really, for Reed at the end comes from Hestian himself. It doesn't come from the Order, who, again, the church, the Order, should be holding people accountable. They don't. Or the goddess should be holding people accountable. She doesn't. So I'm not going to believe any of the stakes set up for further books in this series should they materialize, because this book has proven the consequences don't matter. It reminds me a little bit of an episode of Whose Line Is It Anyway, where everything's made up and the points don't matter. Here, everything is made up and the consequences don't matter, and you cannot do that to readership and expect them to be satisfied. On Amazon, this book is listed as one of one in a series, which means it has the potential to manifest more books in the future, but we don't have release dates for them yet. That could be good, meaning that Blake is refusing to be put on deadline and wants to put all the time she needs into bringing forth the next book, and so they don't have a particular date set for it yet. Or that could be less good, meaning that the publisher is waiting to see how well this book does and what the response is before they commit to future books. I don't know. Either way, though, this book, for me, is a mostly meh. And I don't know that I will continue with the series at all, given how truly unsatisfying it was on all levels. So, Champion of Fate by Kendare Blake, meh. I read it, so you don't have to. Till we meet again, read on, write on, and stay sharp.